Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Alison. I'd like to thank ODI, the Institute for Government, for allowing us to use their magnificent building. Lord Sainsbury and Lord Adonis, Peter Riddle, all old friends of mine. I see, just to remind me of other things, there's a picture of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley there. When I think of my activities breaking the climate change deadlock, trying to bring different religious faiths together in the Middle East peace, it's a relief to turn to the positive optimism around Africa. It's also gives me an opportunity to just say that one of the things I am proudest of in government was the creation of the Department for International Development. And to say a word of thanks to them for the leadership they give worldwide. I have to say it was always a slightly uneasy relationship in government. I'll never forget actually visiting an African country and meeting the head of DFID there and saying to him, you know, because I was Prime Minister, you're with our government. He said, no, I'm with DFID. I thought, the culture very nicely, actually. And was, in a sense, I can probably say this now, why they were so good at doing what they did. It wasn't always easy. I'm going to deliver some prepared remarks, really trying to say where I think we should center this debate in the run-up to Busan. I would also like to say, though, that I'm pleased that the consensus that has developed around overseas aid has carried on in the change of government. I think that's important. I think it gives certain stability to our commitment and also gives a certain security for the country in its position today as one of the leading voices on development and aid. We should never forget the first purpose of aid. Alongside the obvious mission to help those in need, its purpose obviously is to help countries stand on their own feet. The purpose, in other words, ultimately, is to use aid to end aid. For the first time, I think this is possible to foresee, and personally, I think it's a sign of progress. In my experience, there's a new generation of African leaders in politics, in business, in civic society, who are anxious to take the destiny of their own countries in their own hands. And we should encourage and support them. That's the challenge for the international community, and I see many eminent development leaders in this room today. And it's the idea behind the creation of the Africa Governance Initiative. The whole purpose of AGI is to help governments to be in a position where they run their own countries in their own way successfully. None of this, however, discounts the vital role that aid has played in saving lives in Africa. And I think it's really important to state this up front at the very beginning. Access to, for example, access to antiretroviral drugs for those living with AIDS has increased tenfold since 2001, mainly through the PEPFAR program and through the work of foundations like the Gates and Clinton Foundations. Literally millions of people have benefited every year. Measles deaths have halved through vaccination programs. Malaria has fallen sharply in many parts of Africa. And it's potentially very good news with the development of a vaccine today announced. A lot of that coming about in part because of the support that many had given. So aid works for sure, and works particularly, I think, in areas like disease, relief of famine, relieving the worst effects of poverty. And when I chaired the G8 in 2005, the Gleneagles Summit, we put aid and debt cancellation at the top of the agenda. And that was very deliberate. I did so because I knew these commitments would have a big and lasting effect. And they have. On the other hand, the other part of what we did was often less noticed, which was a focus around the work of the Commission on Africa. And the purpose of that was very much to say that the future should be about a partnership between African nations and the developed world and move beyond the concept of aid alone. Now, we recognized right away that this partnership was a two-way street. The wealthy nations had to give, but it was important that they gave in such a way as to create the ability of the African countries to govern themselves effectively. And that meant getting behind African governments' own priorities and using local systems to deliver aid. The Paris principles, in my view, are still the right ones as to how aid should be delivered, and the international community should live up to those principles. For the African countries, though, it also placed responsibility on them, an emphasis on governance, and indeed we established a series of peer reviews in order to test this. Where I would develop this concept of not just aid effectiveness but governance is to say that for me, governance has never been simply an evaluation of transparency and accountability. Of course, the growth of democracy is one of the great signs of progress in Africa. The fact that you've got elections happening which are free and fair and governments changing hands, that's an enormous sign of progress. Governance, however, is also about effectiveness, about the capability to get things done. And it's here that I believe African leaders and countries need most support. Let's assume for a moment, with any African country, assume good faith. Not always the correct assumption, but usually nowadays. And assume also the right vision, which is often the case. In my experience, the tough part is not wanting to do the right thing or even knowing what the right thing is. It's doing it that's hard. Right? The challenge is less the what, it's more the how. And many of the leaders that I know in Africa, and indeed elsewhere, work 18-hour days, 7 days a week, but prioritization is hard, resources are scarce, capacity around them is low, they end up trying to do everything themselves, with additional demands of international diplomacy, international meetings, social, political events. When you then analyze the amount of their time they're able to spend on their priorities, it's a shockingly disproportionate amount. And the governments themselves often don't have the capabilities to support them in the way they need. What this means then is that their capacity to implement, track, and monitor performance isn't there. So, I will frequently see a case where an African country will have a great development plan, right, which has been produced with the most expert advice in the world. It will have 150 priorities in it. You know that there is no way in one term they are going to deliver more than 5 if they're lucky. And by the way, if they do, that would be great, because the 5 often will have a huge indicative effect on the whole of the country. And even if the centre has capacity, what I often find is the ministries individually don't. Now, African governments, of course, have made huge progress in growing their private sectors and attracting investment. This is one of the great opportunities in Africa. And that's got to be part of the long-term answer. But again, when you look at the private sector investment coming into Africa, often it arrives in a random way, sometimes from investors of dubious quality. Decisions are haphazard, often, even if they're honest. And in the area of resources, how a deal is structured and done can be the single most important determinant of the economic future of that country. So there's a huge need for the capacity to be able to take those decisions, to be able to get the right type of deal structured in the right way, to get the right legal advice and commercial advice as to how these deals should be done for the greatest benefit of the country. The purpose of the Africa Governance Initiative is we're there to help on the ground from people who've done it, not just talked about it. We understand that the right technical answer will not always be the right politically or practically doable one. We know that if you miss the politics, you miss the point. It's true in Africa, it's true anywhere. And we start from the position that it's the African country's priorities, not ours, that are on the agenda, and that in achieving them, you need some political realism in the plan. As Alison was just saying, we started in 3 countries. We're now in a 4th. We will move on probably to another 1 or 2 by the end of this year. So we're growing the whole time. I think the results are the best witness. Just take one example, the type of work that we're able to do with this somewhat different model of capacity building and development. The concept of free healthcare for pregnant women and under fives has been knocking around as an idea in Sierra Leone for decades. There were even donor resources there available to do it, including very generous backing from our own DFID. But until the government, under President Koroma, had lined up the political will and the basic systems to deliver this care, nothing was happening. Once that did happen, however, and we played a small but I hope significant part in that, the reform happened at speed. And since that free healthcare has been introduced for mothers and young children, we've got almost 3 times as many under 5s being treated in hospital, and a reduction of something like 80% in deaths in hospital from the previous 12 months. I mean, if you calculate all that together, it's thousands of lives that are saved. But the only way it could have worked is by building the capacity in the system to get it done, and that's my point. The good news, though, is that one of the reasons we're able to do this today is that there is a genuine desire in those African countries, I think it's one of the big changes that's happened, to understand that the key to effective leadership today is around effective government that actually gets things done. So there's a drive behind these types of changes that I think going back a decade, certainly 2 decades, wasn't there in the same way before. Also, the way we need to look at the types of challenges, I think, are different. So I think as a result of mobile telephony, the internet, the whole changing picture of technology in the world, for many of these countries today, if they have, for example, power, electricity, basic infrastructure, the world opens up to them. So what that means is their natural resources can then be exploited, and then there's no sensible reason why they can't create a tax base, raise revenue, start developing services like health and education. And what's more, by the way, with innovation and technology, they can move ahead rapidly. The point is, however, without that first step being taken, which depends critically on the capacity to get things done, without those first steps, for example, in power or electricity being taken and implemented, then they can remain mired in underdevelopment, and then all the fine visions that everyone comes to power with, and by the way, but in African countries particularly, people come to power with these great visions of change. Those visions end up getting lost in a sea of disillusion and resentment if those basic steps can't be taken. So sometimes what we do is we focus, we did this, for example, in Sierra Leone, also in Liberia, just focus on something basic, right? Make sure that the power system actually works in the capital city. It may not seem the most extraordinary and invigorating and inspiring message, but if you're living without electricity and suddenly you've got it, in today's world, everything changes around you. That's why democracy and delivery, in my view, have to go hand in hand. And capacity is, in the end, the only long-term answer. Now, it's got to be built in partnership with the countries concerned. It's got to involve structured and effective decision-making. But here is also some good news. Around the world, the lessons of effective government are actually pretty readily available. Now, again, doing it's very tough. I spent 10 years learning them in Britain. And it's obviously different in a developed country like Britain. But it's remarkable in the way how similar the thing is when you come down to the basic point of decision-making. One of the things I'm able to say now I've left office is that you do actually learn during the course of your time. Now, you can't say this when you're in office, by the way. Right? You can't, you're Prime Minister for sort of a year, and you say, look, I'm just learning. Right? They say, oh my God, what's been going on? Guys are sort of learning the job, this is not acceptable. But the truth is, there are basic lessons in government that are very, very clear about deciding priorities, getting the right policy to achieve them, execution skills to deliver them, and tracking them at the top to make sure that it happens. Right? This is, if we're looking at how aid is more effective today, and we're looking at how it develops, what I'd like to put as part of this agenda of aid effectiveness is building that effective capacity to get things done. Right? That is, in my view, as important as anything else, because once that happens, then the idea of ending aid dependency in a generation, which some people talk about today, doesn't become an impossible dream anymore. And by the way, that is the purpose of it all. I mean, the purpose for any of these countries is not that they continue in a situation where they are aid dependent, but where the aid is a support to help them through this growing period until the day when they're capable of doing it themselves. Because, by the way, and this is my final point by way of opening, they always do want to do it themselves. I mean, the one reason why I'm optimistic about Africa today, above all else, I mean, I think you can quote McKinsey's reports and statistics, and you can say why, this or that indicator shows that Africa is on its way up. You can quote the growth figures and all the rest of it. It's actually none of that really stands out for me. What stands out for me about Africa today is that when I'm there now, I get the same sense that actually I got in India going back maybe 15 years. And that is, there is a different spirit of possibility, determination, self-reliance there. I notice this with the younger generation of African leaders. I notice this with some of the people starting businesses there. I notice it in civic society. It's a new generation coming on. They're grateful for the help, but they know in the end that the greatest sign of progress will be when they shake hands and say thank you very much and make their own way themselves. And I think that is possible today in a way that even when we were talking about this in 2005 at Glen Eagles, it wasn't. And that, for me, is the single most exciting thing. Because if we can help turn, if we can make aid effective in the sense that it turns that spirit of optimism into a genuine line of achievement in building the basic capacity to deliver programs, then the central conundrum of Africa will be resolved, which is that it's a rich continent with poor people. So that's our aim. We like to play a small part in that. And I think this is absolutely the optimum and right moment to have a debate about aid, its effectiveness, and where we go from now. I think there's a huge pride in what's been achieved, and there should be, by the way, but there's also a recognition that now is a moment of inflection where we need to work out the future in a somewhat different way from the past. Thank you.